Welcome to our study of the book of Daniel. This is a work of the Mediview Church of Christ in Mesquite, Texas. And now, here is Mike Heisel with today's lesson.
He cared not for the things of the veil, but trusted one who never failed. Oh, Daniel prayed, every morning, noon, and night.
Once again, I want to thank you for joining me in our study of the book of Daniel. Please go ahead and open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 11. That's where our study is going to focus today. Before we get into Daniel, however, I want to remind you of something that I mentioned in the introduction to last week's video. Obviously, we're nearing the end of this book, and my plan is, after we finish up with Daniel, to move on to the Gospel according to Mark. Now, that's what we'll do unless I hear from a number of you and there's something else that you want to study. So if Mark isn't good for you, let me know. And if there's several of you who want to study something else, well, we'll look at that instead of Mark. But right now the plan is to move on to the Gospel according to Mark. Now, as we said last week, as we studied Daniel chapter 10, these last three chapters in the book of Daniel form a single unit. And Daniel chapters 10, 11, and 12 chronologically are the last material in the book. You remember, they date to the third year of the reign of Cyrus, so they date to about 536 BC. And what precipitates this vision that Daniel's going to receive is the fact that now that Cyrus is king, Cyrus has issued the decree and he's allowed the Jews to return to their homeland. And he's given them permission to rebuild the temple. And so as Ezra chapter 1 says, the first group returned. And Ezra 3 says that they laid the foundation. They began rebuilding the temple. But Ezra 4 points out that shortly thereafter, they begin to receive some opposition. And they stop rebuilding the temple. And so it seems like reports of that are what has caused Daniel to be bewildered. Why, God, are the Jews hindered from rebuilding the temple when you allowed them to return to their homeland? And so Daniel is fasting and Daniel is praying and seeking some information from God as to why the Jews were suffering as they were. And as we saw last week, that as Daniel began to pray, this angel was dispatched with a message for Daniel. And the angel, once he got into Persian territory, was hindered by, for lack of a better term, the patron angel for the Persian Empire. And there was this wrestling match that went on with them for 21 days until finally Michael, whom we saw last week is sort of the patron angel for the Jews at that time. He came and he helped this angel who was sent to Daniel in his wrestling against the patron angel for Persia and allowed this angel to be freed from the Persian angel. And so now this angel has come to Daniel. And the angel will give Daniel a vision. And the vision proper will stretch from chapter 11, verse 2 through chapter 12 and verse 4. And the message of the vision is that in the future, the Jewish people are going to face an even greater opposition against them, an even greater time of persecution. In fact, look at chapter 12 and verse 1 with me. At that time, and when we get to this verse, we're going to see that the context is the time of the persecution of the Jews at the hands of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So at that time, Michael, the great prince, that is, he's the archangel, the patron angel for the Jews, who protects your people, will arise. There will be a great time of distress such as not happened from the beginning of the nations until then. So essentially what Daniel is told is, Daniel, you think things are bad now. You think things have been bad in the past. What the Jews are going to experience in the future is going to be far worse. And so we're going to study then this period of time that stretches from the present day for Daniel, which again, that's 536 BC, down to this time of greater persecution for the Jews, which will last until about 164 BC. So that's going to be the time frame that we're going to be looking at in this vision, from 536 BC down to 164 BC. Now let me just say at the outset, to prepare you, that there's going to be a lot of historical details that we're going to go over in this chapter. And we're going to go over them because they are foretold in this chapter. And in order to understand these verses, you've got to understand some of these historical details. So just to prepare you, it's going to be a little bit confusing at times just because of the amount of historical material, if you're not already familiar with this time period. So understand that you can stop this video at any time. You can rewind it. I would encourage you to get out a study Bible or a commentary. Read over those things that are found in a study Bible or a commentary. They'll help you to understand what we're talking about just a little bit better. But today we're going to focus not on the whole chapter, that is not on the whole of Daniel chapter 11, but we're going to focus on verses 2 through 20. Now we're going to say verses 21 through 45 until next week, because really verses 21 to 45 is the focus. That's the main part of this vision. That's when the prophecy is going to be given to Daniel concerning that persecution of Antiochus for Epiphanes against the Jews. It's going to focus on that time period from about 175 to 164, but today we're going to look at verses 2 to 20, and it's going to focus on the time period from, again, Daniel's present day 536 down to 175. So we've got a long period of time that we're going to look at in these verses today. But before we get into the verses, let me just say a word concerning maybe an additional value that chapters 10 through 12 give us to the overall theme of God's sovereignty. As we've said multiple times, the theme of the book of Daniel is the fact that God rules in the kingdoms of men and He gives them to whomever He wills. As we look out at the politics of the day, it looks like it's just men striving against one another. But Daniel lets us know that there is a God in heaven whose hand is actually involved in the affairs of men. And when we go to the voting booth and it seems like the people choose the new president, etc. It appears like it's just human beings at work. But Daniel lets us know, again, that it's God who rules in the kingdoms of men and He gives them to whomever He wills. God is sovereign. But these chapters give us an additional detail. They let us know that it's not just God, but it's also God working through spiritual forces, both good spiritual forces and evil spiritual forces. And the struggles of men on earth in many ways they mirror the struggles of these good and evil angels in the spiritual realm. Now that truth is something that is revealed to us on both sides of the vision that we're going to look at in the next 2 weeks. This truth is revealed both in chapter 10 of Daniel and in chapter 12 of Daniel. Now we noted chapter 10 verse 13 last week, where the angel says, "But the prince of the Persian kingdom," that is, this patron angel for Persia, "resisted me 21 days. That is, just as people in the Persian Empire were opposing the Jews and hindering the Jews from rebuilding the temple, this angel who's been sent to Daniel is hindered by this patron angel for Persia." But then he goes on to say, "Then Michael, one of the chief princes," that is this patron angel for Israel, he says, "he came to help me because I was detained there with the king of Persia." So Michael and this other angel sent to Daniel struggle against this patron angel for Persia. And then the angel goes on to say to Daniel in verse 20 of chapter 10, "Do you know why I've come to you? Soon I'll return to fight against the prince of Persia." So I'm going to continue to struggle against the prince of Persia, seemingly so that the Jews ultimately will be able to rebuild the temple and rebuild Jerusalem, etc. And when I go, the Prince of Greece will come. Now, what we're going to read about in the main in chapter 11 is the struggles that the Jewish people are going to have during the reign of the Grecian empires. And so that's going to be this Prince of Greece struggling against this angel and struggling against Michael to the detriment of God's people, to the detriment of the Jews. But then chapter 12, verse 1, again, dealing with the end of the persecution of the Jews by Antiochus IV Epiphanes, we're told at that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. So seemingly he will arise and he will struggle against the Prince of Greece to deliver the Jewish people. So, this truth that the persecution of God's people and the struggle against God's people in this world, reflects this spiritual warfare. It's revealed for us in the book of Revelation. You remember when we were studying Revelation, and we talked about this a little bit last week. In Revelation chapter 13, we're told about the rise of the beast. And the beast is the Roman emperor who persecutes the church. And we're told that this beast receives his power from the dragon. Well, the dragon is a reference to the devil. And in Revelation chapter 16, here's what we're told. Beginning in verse 13. Then I saw 3 impure spirits, that is demons, that looked like frogs. They came out of the mouth of the dragon, Satan, and out of the mouth of the beast, the Roman emperor, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, that is, that segment in the Roman government that enforced the worship of the emperor, okay? They are demon spirits that perform signs, and they go out to the kings of the whole world. That is, these client kings under the Roman emperor, to gather them for the battle on the great day of God Almighty. And so these demons stir up these client kings in the persecution of God's people, trying to enforce emperor worship. So again, what happens so often in the affairs of men is the result of these spiritual forces. Okay, so with all of that, let's go ahead and jump into the verses here in Daniel chapter 11. And, I'm going to try to limit the amount of detail that I give just so it's not too confusing. But again, if you have questions concerning this material, be sure to ask me. But keep in mind, you can always stop and you can rewind. And I would encourage you to look at this material, especially in a study Bible. Sometimes in study Bibles, the notes can be misleading, especially when you get into the New Testament and you get into the more doctrinal matters. But when it comes to historical details, study Bibles are really, really helpful. So chapter 11, verse 2. So the angel says to Daniel, "Now then I tell you the truth." Which remember, chapter 10 and verse 21, the angel says, "But first I will tell you what is written in the book of truth." And the book of truth is this book, if you will, of God's sovereignty, God's foreknowledge concerning what would happen in the nations, God's plan concerning what He would do among the nations. So this angel is revealing the future to Daniel. This future recorded in the book of truth, and the angel says to Daniel, "This is the truth." And sure enough, when we look back on this prophecy from the standpoint of looking back through history, we see that what the angel revealed to Daniel is exactly what took place. So he says, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and then a 4th who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. So who's the king at this present time? Well, chapter 11, verse 1 mentions Darius the Mede, but remember chapter 10 and verse 1 says Cyrus, king of Persia. And course, we've argued that I think the best explanation is that Darius the Mede is a throne name for Cyrus, the king of Persia. So Cyrus is the king at this particular point in time, and Daniel says there will be 3 more kings who will arise until a 4th rich king arises. Now, in Persia, there were 13 kings total, right? The Persian Empire, Medo-Persian Empire, lasted from 539 BC, the fall of Babylon, until 331 BC. So, it lasted just over 200 years, and in those 200 years, there were 13 Persian emperors. The last king of Persia was Darius III. But the 3 kings who would arise after Cyrus seems to be a reference to Cyrus' son Cambyses, and then to Smerdis, which he was an impostor, and then to Darius. And by the way, Darius is the king who's mentioned in the book of Ezra, beginning in Ezra chapter 5, and he's mentioned also in the book of Haggai and in the book of Zechariah. He's the emperor who would give the Jews permission to begin again the rebuilding of the temple. And under Darius' reign, the rebuilding of the temple was completed in 516. Okay, so the 3 kings who would follow Cyrus were, again, Cambyses, Smerdis, and then Darius. But then Daniel says a 4th king will arise, a rich king. Well, who's this 4th king? Well, this 4th Persian king, I believe, is the king mentioned in the book of Esther. Now, the king in Esther is, your Bible may say, Ahasuerus, that's the Hebrew form. But Xerxes is the way that it's translated in the NIV, and that's what he was known as in Persia, Xerxes. And Xerxes was the king that Esther was married to. And Xerxes was a very rich king. You might turn and look at the book of Ezra. Look at Ezra 1 and verse 4. For a full 180 days he, that is Xerxes, displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. Now Xerxes did stir up the Persians against Greece. He invaded Greece, but he was defeated. In 480 BC, he was defeated at a naval battle in Salamis. And by the way, if I'm not mistaken, the anniversary of his defeat was this past Sunday. On September, 20th, 480 BC, Xerxes was defeated by Themistocles at the naval battle of Salamis. Well, that's exactly what the angel foretold to Daniel here in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 2. All right, let's move on to verse 3. Then a mighty king will arise, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. Now, who is this mighty king who would arise? Well, I believe this mighty king is a prophecy concerning Alexander the Great. Now, we've already read in Daniel about this struggle that would come between the Persian Empire and Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire. So back in Daniel chapter 8, you remember how we read that there was this great ram who had 2 horns. One horn was longer than the other, and that was a reference to the Medo-Persian Empire. In fact, it's explicitly interpreted that way, chapter 8 and verse 20. Right? And so, it prospers for a while until this he-goat comes along. And this he-goat has one notable horn. And that notable horn has a reference to Alexander the Great. And so this he-goat charges furiously without touching the land and comes and butts and defeats and tramples underfoot that ram. And it has reference to Alexander the Great and how Alexander the Great conquered Darius III, the last king of the Medo-Persian Empire, in a series of battles between 334 and 331 BC. All right, so moving on to verse 4. After he has arisen, His empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the four winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. So remember how we read back in chapter 8 that that notable horn would be shattered, and in its place 4 horns would arise. And it has reference to the fact that, Alexander the Great, he rose to power in 336 BC when his father, Philip of Macedon, died. And in a short period of time, in 12 years, he became the king of the whole world between Macedonia and India. He conquered past the Indus River. He conquered down into Egypt. But in 323 BC, before his 33rd birthday, he died of a fever in the city of Babylon. And when he died, his son was not yet born. His son was born after his death. And so his kingdom did not go to his son, but for about 20 years after the death of Alexander the Great, there was a struggle between Alexander's generals. And finally, 4 of his generals have power. His kingdom is divided up between 4 rulers. So you've got Cassander, and we've already gone over this multiple times. Cassander, who rules Greece and Macedonia. Lysimachus, who rules Thrace. But then really the focus of this vision is going to be the eastern part of Alexander's empire. It's going to be the generals of Cyrus who end up ruling over Syria, and also there's going to be Mesopotamia and Persia that the Syrian Empire is going to control, and Egypt. And caught right in the middle of that is Palestine. And so that's why it's being told to us. It's because the Jewish people in Palestine are caught in the middle of this struggle between what used to be Alexander the Great's empire, but now is an empire ruled by a couple of his generals, right? The Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucid Empire in Syria. And there is Israel right in the middle. And so that's why it's being revealed to us. Now, when we get to verse 5, well, we are in verse 5. when we start looking here, beginning in verse 5, the dynasty of kings who are going to rule in Syria, they're going to be described as the king of the north. Now, it's multiple kings, but these multiple kings are called the king of the north, right? And so the kings who rule over Egypt, the Ptolemies, they're going to be referred to as the king of the south. Now, again, it's multiple kings, but it's the king of the south. Now, actually, the period of time covered in Daniel chapter 11, there's going to be 8 kings of the north, right? So 8 people in the Seleucid dynasty who are called the king of the north in chapter 11. And there's going to be 6 who are part of the Ptolemaic dynasty who rule over Egypt, who are going to be called king of the south. Now, why that language? Why the king of the north and why the king of the south? Well, everything is spoken of from the perspective of the Jewish people. And from the Jewish people in Palestine, Syria is to the north. And to the Jewish people in Palestine, Egypt is to the south. So that's why it's the king of the north and the king of the south. So from chapter 11, verse 5, all the way through chapter 12 and verse 4, the focus is going to be upon this section of what used to be Alexander's empire, the Seleucid dynasty in the north, the Ptolemaic dynasty in the south, and their struggle involving the Jewish people who are in the middle. Now, initially, Palestine is going to be under the control of the Ptolemies who are in the south. Okay, so from about 323 BC until 198 BC, the Jewish people are going to be under the control of Egypt, the Ptolemies, the king of the south. But then in 198 BC, and stretching on to 142 BC, which is not covered in this section, but that's when the Jews are going to gain their independence for about 80 years, from 142 BC until Pompey establishes Roman dominance in the east, 63 BC, the Jews are going to be independent. But from 198 BC until 142 BC, Palestine and the Jews are going to be under the control of the king of the north, that is, under the control of the Seleucids. All right, so verse 5. The king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his own kingdom with great power. Now, who is the king of the south? Well, the king of the south refers to the first king of this Ptolemaic dynasty, and his name is Ptolemy the First. And so the dynasty gets its name from him, Ptolemy the First. So he is king of the south. He will become strong. But one of his commanders, and that's a reference to Seleucus I. He, for a period of time, served as a general for Ptolemy, but then later he became king in Antioch, which Antioch is the capital of the Seleucid Empire. Alexandria in Egypt is the capital of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which, by the way, Antioch, the capital of the Seleucid Empire, that's the city from which Paul went out on his missionary journeys. That's the city in which the disciples were first called Christians, Acts chapter 11, verse 26. So, it's going to be a city that plays a significant role for Christians in the future. All right, but at any rate, so one of his commanders is a reference to Seleucus I. And anyway, he will become stronger than Ptolemy the First and will rule his own kingdom with great power. Now, he becomes stronger because the Seleucid Empire is larger than the Ptolemaic Empire. So that's the idea there. Now, by the way, again, if any of these details get confusing, pause the video, rewind it, look at the verse again, because I'm going to be commenting on what's said in the verses. But at any rate, I may not always give the details in the exact order in which it's given in the verse. So if you get confused, pause it and rewind the video. Verse 6. After some years, so we move down in verse 6 to about 252 BC, okay? So after some years, they will become allies. That is, the king of the north and the king of the south will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she will not return her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days she will be betrayed, together with her royal escort and her father and the one who supported her. All right, so in 252 BC, an alliance is attempted. So the king of the south is Ptolemy II, okay? And he sends his daughter, Bernice, to the king of the north. And the king of the north at this particular point in time is a reference to Antiochus II. Now, there's king between, well, I'm not even going to give you that. I got to be careful that I don't give too many details here. But at any rate, Ptolemy II, which, let me give you this detail. Ptolemy II is the one who's responsible for commissioning the Jews to translate the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. So what we call the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that began under Ptolemy II. So he is a pretty significant king. But at any rate, he betroths his daughter Bernice to Antiochus II. And Antiochus II divorces his wife Laodice and marries Bernice. But at any rate, that only lasts for a few years, because in 248 Antiochus II's first wife, Laodice, upset because her son will not be the king now, she ends up poisoning her husband. She poisons Antiochus II, and she is responsible for the death of Bernice and Bernice's son, and she does all of this so that her son can become king. And her son is Seleucus II. And that same year, Bernike's father, the king of the south, who is Ptolemy II, he dies, okay? Which is going to be a significant fact when we get to the next verse. So verse 7 says, one from her family line, that is, one from Bernike's family line. So we're talking about Ptolemy III, right? So Bernike has died, and her father dies the same year, and so her brother, Bernike's brother, Ptolemy II's son, Ptolemy III, will arise to take her place. He will attack the forces of the king of the north and enter his fortresses. He will fight against them and will be victorious. So we move forward from 248 to 245, right? And so Ptolemy III, upset because his sister has been murdered and her son has been murdered, now he arises against the son of Antiochus II by his first wife, Laodice. He arises against Seleucus II in 245, and he attacks Antioch, and he's victorious. Verse 8 says, he, that is Ptolemy III, will also seize their gods, their metal images, and their valuable articles of silver and gold, and carry them off to Egypt. For some years he will leave the king of the north alone. So when Ptolemy III invaded Antioch and defeated them, he plundered them. And a part of the plunder that he gets are actually objects that initially were Egyptian objects. Back in 525 BC, so we're going back in time to the Persian Empire, Cyrus's son Cambyses conquered Egypt for Persia. And when he conquered Egypt, he entered into temples and plundered temples and carried off gods and riches from Egypt, and they ended up in Antioch. Well, now Ptolemy III has regained, in 245 BC, has regained some of those treasures that had been plundered from the Egyptians in 525 BC. And so he was praised by the people for having done that. Okay, moving on to verse 9. Then the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but will retreat to his own country. So a couple years later, in 243, the king of the north, who is Seleucus II, he invaded the realm of the king of the south. Now, he didn't go down into Egypt, but he invaded the realm that was ruled by Egypt. He came down into southern Syria, and he came down into Palestine. But he's defeated. The Ptolemaic forces end up defeating him. And so, Seleucus too retreats to his own country with his tail between his legs. Verse 10, but his sons, that is Seleucus II's sons, will prepare for war and assemble a great army, which will sweep on like an irresistible flood and carry the battle as far as his fortress. So, Seleucus II's sons both ended up reigning over the Seleucid Empire. Their names are Seleucus III and Antiochus III. Okay? And really, verse 10 telescopes events for about 10 years. Okay? So at any rate, their sons try to regain honor after Seleucus II has been defeated. And so they start raising this army. And when it's mentioned in verse 10 that their army will sweep on like an irresistible flood and will carry the battle as far as his fortress. The fortress there is a reference to the fortress that's ruled by the Ptolemies. It's a reference to Raphia, which is kind of on the border between Palestine and Egypt. And in 217, Antiochus III the Great invades Palestine and has some success in invading Palestine, and he comes to Raphia, but he's defeated by Ptolemy there in Raphia, and ends up retreating. Okay, now verses 11 through 19 are going to focus on one particular king in the north, and his name is Antiochus III the Great. Now, we just mentioned him. He's the son of Seleucus II. Now, why is so much space given to this one king? Well, it's because he's the one who will gain control of Palestine for the Seleucid Empire. Now, it's going to be in his... He reigned from 323 BC until 187 BC. So, he reigned for quite a few years. He's not going to gain control of Palestine until 198 BC. But he's the one who will get control of Palestine for the Seleucid Empire. And by the way, that's not going to be a good thing for the Jewish people. And that's what we're going to talk about next week, because one of Antiochus III the Great's sons, two of his sons reign as king, but the second of his sons who will reign as king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, he's going to be the one who will persecute the Jewish people in a very, very terrible way. But a lot of attention is given to Antiochus III the Great, and that's going to be verses 11 through 19. All right, so verse 11. Then the king of the south, which is a reference to Ptolemy IV, will march out in a rage and fight against the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but it will be defeated. All right, so Antiochus III the Great, he actually invades Palestine, and that's what we were talking about a few moments ago. And he invades Palestine with a huge army, 70,000 soldiers. But when he comes to Raphia, the fortress, so what was talked about at the end of verse 10 is also talked about here in verse 11. When he gets to Raphia, at that particular point in time, the king of the north is, Ptolemy IV, and he's going to march out in a rage, and he actually is going to defeat this huge army of Antiochus III the Great. And that takes place in 217 BC. All right, verse 12. When the army is carried off, that is, when Antiochus's army is defeated, when the army is carried off, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will slaughter many thousands, yet he will not remain triumphant. Verse 13. For the king of the north, now that's still Antiochus III the Great, will muster another army larger than the first, and after several years, he will advance with a huge army fully equipped. Now, remember, we've got these terms that's used throughout, the king of the north, the king of the south. And you just read those terms and you think, well, it's talking about the same king. But it's talking about multiple kings. It's talking about one dynasty. So the point in saying that the king of the south in verse 12 will be filled with pride and will slaughter many thousands, yet will not remain triumphant. The point is his dynasty won't remain triumphant. Now verse 13 says that the king of the north will muster another army, and after several years, that is after about 15 years, after Ptolemy IV dies and his son Ptolemy the fifth, becomes king, then Antiochus III will take advantage of that, the fact that you've got a new king, and he'll go to war again, and he's going to have more success this time. All right? So verse 14. In those times, many will rise against the king of the south. Now, the king of the south is still Ptolemy V, okay? Many will rise against the king of the south. Those who are violent among your own people, that is, among the Jews, will rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but without success. Right? So at that particular point in time, in Jerusalem, the Jews were split. In fact, those who were vying for the high priesthood, you had Onias and you had the Tobiad family. They were split. Onias and his followers supported the Seleucids and wanted to throw support behind the Seleucids, that is the king of the north, right? But the Tobiads and their followers supported the Ptolemies, the king of the south. And so, you've got this political difference among the Jews. And so, maybe when it said those who are violent among your own people will rebel, maybe it's talking about the fact that, Onias and his followers supported Seleucid control over Palestine, and so they rebelled against Ptolemy and, against the Tobiads and those who supported Ptolemaic rule over Palestine. That may be what's being referred to. I mean, this is one of the verses where you've got a little bit of general information, but you can't be just totally certain what it's talking about. But generally, from what we know about history and what this is saying, it's true, but we just can't be sure about the meaning of all the details. All right, verse 15. Then the king of the north, reference to Antiochus III, will come and build up siege ramps and will capture a fortified city, which is probably a reference to Sidon, and the forces of the south, the forces of Ptolemy V, and that would be under General Scopas, will be powerless to resist. Even their best troops will not have strength to stand. So in a couple of battles, the battle at Sidon, the battle at Panias, Antiochus III the Great has success and is able to conquer the Ptolemaic forces. And so in 198 BC, then control of Palestine is gained by the king of the north. It's gained by the Seleucids. And again, that's not going to turn out well for the Jews because they're going to suffer much more under the Seleucids than what they ever suffered under the Ptolemies. They fared generally pretty well under the Ptolemies, but not so well under the Seleucids. But the Seleucids are going to have control of Palestine from 198 BC until 142 BC, when the Jews will gain their independence for a short 80-year period of time until they come under Rome's thumb. Verse 16, the invader, talking about Antiochus III, will do as he pleases. No one will be able to stand against him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land. The beautiful land there is a reference to Palestine. You remember how it's described in the book of Exodus to Moses. It's the land of milk and honey, the beautiful land. So, again, 198, Antiochus III gains control of Palestine. And he will have the power to destroy it. Verse 17, he will determine to come with the might of his entire kingdom and will make an alliance with the king of the south, and he will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom, but his plans will not succeed or help him. So at this particular point in time, the Romans are invading Greece, and the Grecian people are reaching out to Antiochus III asking for help. And so Antiochus III, knowing he's had this struggle with the Ptolemies, decides he's got to do something to try to stabilize things with the Ptolemies so he can then go and, help the Greeks against the Romans. And so, he tries to form this alliance. So, Antiochus III gives his daughter in marriage to Ptolemy V, and his daughter is Cleopatra. Now, this is not the Cleopatra of fame. This is an earlier Cleopatra, but anyway, he betroths his daughter Cleopatra to Ptolemy V. And, he's thinking that, Cleopatra will retain her loyalty to her father, her loyalty to Antiochus III. That will give him some say in the affairs of Egypt, the affairs among the Ptolemies, but that's not how it works out. Actually, Cleopatra is loyal to her new husband, to Ptolemy V. Okay, and so, this arranged marriage, as it says in verse 17, will not succeed or help him. That is, won't help Antiochus III. All right, verse 18. Then he will turn his attention to the coastlands. The coastlands refer to Greece, okay, because again, the Romans are troubling them. And will take many of them, but a commander will put an end to his insolence and will turn his insolence back on him. So, Antiochus III goes and, starts fighting against the Romans there in Greece, but he's defeated in a couple of battles. In 191, he's defeated at the Battle of Thermopylae. In 190, he's defeated at the Battle of Magnesia. And in 188, he has to sign this humiliating treaty with the Romans. He has to agree to pay tribute to them, and he has to give them 20 prisoners to guarantee, his loyalty to this oath. And one of the prisoners that he gives them is a son, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Now, Antiochus IV Epiphanes is going to be the subject of verses 21 to 45. He's going to be that contemptible person who's going to persecute the Jews terribly. But at any rate, this is what verse 18 talks about. But verse 19 says, "After this, he will turn back toward the fortresses of his own country, but will stumble and fall to be no more." So, what does it mean he'll turn back toward the fortresses of his own country? Well, remember, he's got to pay tribute to the Romans, and it's a lot of tribute. And so what he does is he goes and he plunders temples to try to get fortresses and temples to try to get the money to try to pay this tribute to Rome. And so in the process of plundering these fortresses, he meets his end. He stumbles and he falls. In fact, in 187, he's in Elymas, and he's plundering the temple of Bel, and he's put to death while he's plundering the temple of Bel. All right? So now, verse 20. His successor, which remember he has the two sons, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who's a prisoner in Rome, and so Antiochus IV Epiphanes' older brother, Seleucus IV, becomes king. He succeeds Antiochus III the Great to become king. So his successor will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor. In a few years, however, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. All right, so Seleucus IV sends out this tax collector, Heliodorus, in order to get taxes among the Jews. And in fact, you can read about this in the Apocrypha. It's talked about in the book of 2 Maccabees chapter 3. All right, so, and that's an interesting story. We won't go into it, but that's an interesting story. However, Heliodorus ultimately will poison Seleucus IV. And so Seleucus IV will be killed. His son won't come to the throne, but rather Antiochus IV Epiphanes will. And that brings us up to verse 21 of Daniel chapter 11. And that's where, Lord willing, we'll begin next week. So again, I know that a lot of historical details here. I know this is confusing, but I do hope that it helps you in understanding these verses. And by the way, you want proof of the Bible's inspiration? Right here it is. The fact that in 536 BC, Daniel could foretell with such detail these events that would transpire is proof he didn't write as a mere man. He wrote as a man who was led by the Holy Spirit. God gave Daniel these incredible visions, these prophecies of the future. So this is faith-building material. That's the way that we ought to approach it. Not, oh man, all these historical details, I just can't keep up with them. We need to approach this as faith-building material, proof of the Bible's inspiration. So, Lord willing, we'll study Daniel 11:21 through 45 next week. God bless you.
We thank you for taking the time to worship with us and to study a portion of God's Word. We pray that this has been an edifying experience and that you would join us again. Now, if at any point during the lesson you had some questions, please feel free to email us at mhisal@meadowview.org. The email is both on the screen and in the description below. It is our goal to answer every Bible question with a Bible answer, to speak where the Bible speaks, and to be silent where it is silent. God bless you. We love you.